I am going to introduce you to Grunt. I'm going to talk about Grunt and what it is, how you use it, and why you'd want to. So Grunt, that's its logo. It is a warthog. What is it? They bill it as the JavaScript task runner. That means it's something that helps you complete tasks that you want to get done as a developer. Things like compiling Sass. If you use Sass, which is a pre-processed CSS language, to make it easier and more convenient and efficient to write CSS, you need to convert that into actual CSS that web browsers understand. Grunt can do that for you automatically. Sometimes you want to compress your JavaScript, your CSS, and HTML files. The smaller the file size of the assets you send over the internet, the faster your website will be to people who use it. So one of the key techniques is to compress everything. Make your JavaScript smaller, make your images smaller, your CSS and your HTML. You can do that by stripping out white space and doing various clever tricks to reduce the amount of memory that the files take up. Well, hey. So, if this were a course, I'd say stop, let's go back, and I'd re-record that whole section. But can't do that. You can also do things like concatenate files. So, for example, you might be writing a rather complex website. Maybe you're using a framework like Angular or Ember or Backbone, and you have all these things. Maybe you've got jQuery thrown in there. The more files that have to be requested and sent over the internet to your end user, the slower the performance of your website. In fact, it's been documented that one of the biggest problems and latency points with the responsiveness of a website is the number of files you have to send across the wire in order for someone to see your site. So another strategy to make your site perform faster for your end users is to take all your JavaScript files, munge them together into a single file so that they're delivered one time over the internet to your end users. Grunt can help with that. So what is a task? A task is just an automated command. You can create your own, or you can choose from over 4,000 Grunt plugins. They do things that help front-end web developers, but they can do things that just help anybody working on their computer. I mean, basically, it's something that can work with your file system, make changes to files, move files around, do sorts of manipulations on files, and you don't even have to use it necessarily for web development, though that still is the most common use for it. So you use it to do those kinds of tasks I just talked about, concatenating, minifying, compiling. So let me just do a quick demo, and this is the end result of where we're going to be getting to tonight as I show you how to use Grunt. So I'm going to, run Grunt, and this will be weird to you right now, but what I've done is just run what's called a watch task. So Grunt is sitting there watching me make changes to my site. So I've got here a website. Really just a web page. And it's got some JavaScript on it, does some things. Woo, cool. It's got a bunch of CSS. And it's using Sass. So all the CSS is written in Sass, or at least in Sass files. So I can go into, this is a Sass file. You can see it's called main.scss. So if you tried to load that right into a web browser, nothing would happen because web browsers don't understand .scss files. But I can just make a change here, and hopefully it'll work. Oh. Let's see. And notice that my web page updated live, interactively. I make a change. So I can say, I'm going to make this blue, and I'm going to save it. So what's happening behind the scenes is you can see that this is the watch tasks. As I make changes to that file, Grunt is compiling my SCSS files, spitting them out as CSS that can be used by the web browser. With the addition of this wait task, I can do that live and interactively just by changing my Sass files and updating a live view of my web page. Pretty cool stuff. It is refreshing the browser. Isn't that crazy? It's like magic. It is like magic, so it's cool. So let's talk about a little bit about it before. So that's the cool part. Let's talk about the less cool part. There's some software dependencies, meaning there's a lot of crap you got to install and make sure it works correctly. Node, which is a JavaScript runtime. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. NPM, which is a package manager that lets you load what are called modules or packages, in other words, JavaScript code that you can run on your computer. There's this thing called the Grunt CLI, which is the command line interface to run Grunt. You have to install that. And then, as if that weren't confusing enough, there's this other thing called Grunt. There's Grunt CLI and there's Grunt. I'll talk about those two differences in a second. And then there are plugins. You got to install those. Those are the things that let you, for example, compile Sass to CSS, or minify your JavaScript, or check to make sure your HTML is valid before you launch it. Okay, so it's like going down the rabbit hole. A lot of people try to start using Grunt or a front-end tool like Gulp, and they quickly get lost because you're chasing one thing after another after another. As I mentioned, there are these software dependencies. You need Node, you need NPM, you need Grunt CLI, you need Grunt, you need the plugins. Miss any of those steps, and you're lost. Okay? So my job here tonight is to guide you through the rabbit hole and catch the rabbit at the end. Let's see if I can do it. So I'm going to start with just a high-level overview so you can see where we are going and where we want to end up. So we have to install Node.js. That's the most important first step. Everything in this ecosystem is dependent on Node.js running on our computer. Then we install this thing called Grunt CLI. I'll talk about that in a minute. Then we create this file called package.json. So you can see how we're going down the rabbit hole. Every possible place we might be veering off, we could crash at any moment. We got to do all of these things to make it work. We install Grunt. I'll talk about what the difference is between Grunt CLI and Grunt in a second. And then we install our plugins. And then we have to create this file called the Grunt file, gruntfile.js. All of those things have to be in place in order for Grunt to work on your site. So let's start with Node. Node is what they call a JavaScript runtime. It's based on Chrome's V8 engine. It's basically plucking the JavaScript interpreter out of Chrome and placing it onto your computer so that you can run JavaScript live or interactively in your computer through the terminal or through your console. It's very cool stuff. It's used on server-side stuff for web servers. It's used on your own computer to do all sorts of stuff. It's even used to help build desktop-based applications. And let me skip that one for a second. I'm going to just give you a little pitch here. Andrew Chalkley just launched the Node.js Basics course here at Treehouse this week. Woo! So if you want to get a taste of Node, we got that course on Treehouse. Let me step back for a second. So Node, there's a couple different ways you can install it. See, there's this big green button. You can click that, and that'll download stuff that you can install onto your computer. There's an installer for Mac. There's an installer, I think, for Linux. There's an installer for Windows. If you're on Windows, click that green button, download, and install. If you're on a Mac, however, I do not recommend that approach. I recommend that you read this blog post that I wrote about how to install Node.js and NPM on a Mac. It is another rabbit hole of sorts because you have to install a few other things to get it working. Most importantly, you're installing this thing called Homebrew, which is another type of package manager, installer application for the Mac that lets you install lots of very useful open source software. It makes it easy to install Git, Ruby, and Node.js. One of the big benefits of Homebrew is that it lets you install Node in a place that's separate from areas of your file and operating system that need to be accessed by an administrator. If you use the green little button and install Node down through using the Node.js website, you have to type this command called sudo, which basically says, that's super user do, is that right? Super user do. And basically it gives, you type that in, you have to type in your administrative password, and then at that point, whatever your command you're issuing can do anything it wants to. It's the administrator of your computer. And in general, that's not a good way to take care of your system, is to give other things, other programs, administrative rights to your computer. So I really recommend following this, where you get Homebrew and then you install Node. Another benefit besides the security implications is if you use Homebrew, it makes it really easy to uninstall Node. If something goes wrong, you want to get rid of it, it's a simple command, Homebrew, what is it? Is it delete? brew uninstall node is all it is. If you don't do that, if you use the little green button, there's no simple way. There is no little button that you say uninstall. No, you have files all over your system in various places that are administrative access only, and getting rid of those is a pain in the butt. So use Homebrew if you're on a Mac. Enough of that. So that's the first part of the rabbit hole, and I'm not actually going to demonstrate that to you. I'm going to assume you can go out and learn that stuff. Let's talk about node packages. Okay. There are 2 node packages. So let me back up 1 second. You install node, and then along with node, you get this thing called npm. npm is a package manager. It lets you install other modules of JavaScript that work with node. And you will use npm to install Grunt and other things. So there are 2 critical pieces to Grunt. There's this CLI, which stands for Command Line Interface. And this is something that you install globally. So you'll see this little G flag there. It says npm install -g grunt-CLI. That flag -G means install this globally. It'll be accessible everywhere on your computer through the command line. What the Grunt CLI program does is it handles launching Grunt and running the tasks. It doesn't actually run the tasks. To do that, you need this other thing called Grunt. So there's 2 packages. And Grunt is something that you install in a project. So I'll show you. Oh, you do it this way. npm install Grunt. So you have to go into the project file and install Grunt. Okay? And every single one of your projects that you use Grunt on will have its own installation of Grunt. Why did they design it this way? Because Grunt changes. There's new versions. And once you've built up a system or a project that uses Grunt at a particular version, you don't really want to update it, because that might make trains come roaring through your room. That might happen if you don't do it that way. But anyway, so you install these 2 different things. So let's start with the Grunt CLI. It doesn't matter where you run this command from. So for example, I'm just going to go to terminal. I'm going to quit this thing. And I'll go over here and clear. And I'll just say npm install -g grunt-CLI. It doesn't matter where I am. This is going to install it where it's globally accessible and blah, blah, blah. It does a bunch of stuff. So when you run npm, it installs a module. And then also, you'll notice this stuff. These are dependencies of that module. So it's cool. npm is very smart. If the Grunt CLI requires other things to work, it downloads those and installs those on your computer. It's even smarter if you've already installed those things on your computer. It doesn't go get them a second time. It just uses the versions that you have on your computer. Okay, so we've got the Grunt CLI. What's the next step? Well, let's talk about the project that I'm going to demonstrate for this talk. It's really simple. It's this. But you could imagine it's a big website, lots of pages, blah, blah, blah. So I've got my web page. I've got some images. I've got a CSS folder, and that's going to have this styles.css. I have a JavaScript folder, which is going to have a minified version of JavaScript. And here's my working files. I have a folder here called source, or src. It could be called anything. It doesn't have to be that, but that's what I choose. It's also pretty common. And inside that, I have a JavaScript folder, JS, and I have an SCSS, or a SAS folder. And the JavaScript folder will hold all of my JavaScript assets. So you'll notice I have jQuery in there. I have this thing called scroll2.js, a little thing I wrote to make the page scroll when you clicked on links. And then in the SCSS, I've got my SAS files. And there's a bunch of SAS files in there. There's a main one, this one, and then there are these 2 that are also used. Okay? And so these are the files that I'm going to work on, the ones in the source folder. But Grunt is going to take all those changes that I make to those files and produce this and this for me automatically. It's going to compile my SAS into this styles.css. It's going to minify and concatenate my JavaScript files into this script.min.js. So that's what Grunt is going to do for me. It lets me work on these files and will output files that will go and work on my web server. So that's the project. Now, inside that folder, you'll see I don't have much. I just have an index.html, source, image, CSS, JS. Okay. We need to add some things to this directory, to this project, in order to get Grunt working for us. 2 files you need to understand. There's this thing called package.json. This isn't a Grunt thing, it's a node thing. And it describes your project, the name of the project, the Git repository you have for it, but most importantly, it keeps track of your npm dependencies. That is, it keeps track of the version of Grunt you have, it keeps track of the Grunt plugins you install, and it keeps that all in a nice little file that organizes the packages that you're using to make Grunt work. And Grunt needs that. The second file that you're going to have to create is the grunt file, gruntfile.js. And this is the thing that mostly you're going to write all this stuff. This is what loads plugins, it configures those plugins, it defines the tasks, and basically sets up how you want Grunt to run. So gruntfile.js is extremely important. Okay. And these two files live inside your project's main directory. So creating the package.json file, you could literally have a text editor and just create a new file called package.json and write some JSON, and it's kind of complex, and there's all this weird stuff, and you could mess it up. So don't do that. Instead, go to your project directory using your terminal, your console, or if you're on Windows, PowerShell, whatever it is that you use, and you run this command, npm init. So I'm going to go to terminal, and I'm going to clear here, and I'm going to see where I am. I don't know where I am. I'm in here. I want to go to project start. Make sure that's right. Yep. Okay. And I'll run npm install. What did I do? That is correct. It's mv. Yeah, typing the wrong command. That's what's wrong. Clear. Boo. npm init. There we go. Okay. So it tells you, this is a utility. It'll walk you through the construction of the package.json file. It'll ask you for some information. You give it. You hit return. It asks for more. So project name, we'll call this Grunt, is the name of the project. Version, so I can give it a version. So I'm just starting out here, 00.1. Description, this is a Grunt demo. And the entry point, sometimes this stuff really isn't that important for certain things, but basically the entry point is what is the kind of file that is the core of your whole thing. In this case, it's a website, index.html. Test command, I'm going to skip that. I don't have a Git repo for it. I don't have any keywords. The author is me. You should really use like your whole name, and then you can give it a license, like an MIT license or ISC or whatever. And I'm just going to do that. And so then it's showing you that's what it looks like. Does that look okay? I say, sure, I don't know better. Yes. And there it is. Now I'm going to go to Sublime, and let me open my project. I should have opened that before. Sublime projects, Git meetup. And here you see is the package.json. It would have been a more impressive demo if I'd not had it open. But anyway, that was just created, just miraculously when I did that npm init. So that's now in place. We got that first step done. That's cool. Now we need to install Grunt. Remember, there's the Grunt CLI, and then there's the Grunt that lives in my project. So I say npm install Grunt --save-dev. That --save-dev is really important. That's a flag that indicates that I should store that information into my package.json file. So for example, here's my package.json file as it exists now. And I'll go here and I'll say npm install grunt --save-dev. And it's loading, bump, bump, bump. See, these are dependencies. These are all the different modules that are required for Grunt to work. So those are loaded too. Let me clear this. And there it is. That wasn't there just a second ago. So when I installed it, my package.json file is updated. In addition, you'll look over here, there is now this folder called node modules that didn't exist a second ago. And there's a folder called Grunt. And then there's all these other node modules. So there's all this stuff that got installed. Don't mess with this folder. You don't want to open it or delete it or do anything with it. It's handled by npm. All right. Cool. We got our two files in place. Now we create our gruntfile.js. Okay. So you create this in your project's main directory. This is kind of like the instructions that tell Grunt what you want it to do, the list of tasks and how they're to be performed. So what does it do? It configures your tasks. It says things like, here are the files, JavaScript files, that are my source files, and here's where I want them to go. Here are my SAS files, and I want them to be placed here. Okay? Here are my images. I want you to minify them and place them in this directory. Okay. It also loads plugins, so it tells Grunt, I need this plugin, and this plugin to work. And then finally, it registers what are called tasks. So those are kind of the three main steps. Every time you add a task, like I want to concatenate my JavaScript, I need to configure that task, I need to load the plugin, and then I need to register the task. That's telling Grunt what I want to call this task when I run it. Okay, so this is the skeleton of a grunt.js file. This doesn't do anything. It doesn't have any tasks in it, but this is where you start, and then you're going to fill stuff out. It may look a little daunting. There's a lot of stuff in here. So you may be feeling a little like Alice falling down the rabbit hole, but that's okay. Let's take it one step at a time. This whole module.exports equals function, grunt, blah, 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 that outer stuff, this is a Node thing. Don't worry about it. Don't touch it. You don't need to edit it. You don't need to change it. If you want to learn how module.exports works, take Andrew's Node.js Basics course, and he'll explain that. What you're interested in is these three sections. This is the stuff you change. So let's talk about those. Okay. The init config, grunt.init config, is really important. This is where you sort of configure all the things you want to do. You tell the plugins, like the concatenation plugin, what it has to do, where the files are supposed to go. One really important thing, the first line that you will always add to this configuration is this. This is basically telling Grunt where your package.json file is and loading it so that data is in there. That's letting Grunt know what are all the packages it needs to perform its tasks. So let me start building this. So I'm going to go over to my project. I'm going to add a new file, and I'll save it, and I'll call it grunt file.js. And because I don't want to bore you with my typing, I've got some shortcut little snippets. Boom! Ooh, that's nice. And then I'm going to add this configuration. Okay. So now we're starting to build this up. It won't do anything. If I run grunt now, you won't see anything. It's not going to do anything. So let's add our first task. Before I do that, let me give you an overview of the steps you need to add a task. There's 3 steps. First, you load the plugin. Actually, I guess there's 4 steps. You install the plugin. That should say install the plugin. So npm install, whatever the plugin's name. We'll look at 3 different plugins today. And then you save it to your development, meaning you save it to your package.json file. And then you add a configuration to the grunt file. You load the plugin in the grunt file, and you register the task in the grunt file. And once you've done that, you now have a hopefully functioning task. You can run grunt and do some cool things. So let's uglify your JavaScript. What does that mean? Well, there's actually a plugin called uglify. That's what they call it. And what it does is it takes JavaScript and it munches it down. It converts variables to smaller names. It gets rid of white spaces and carriage returns, and it munges it down to the smallest possible still functioning file size. So it lets you shrink your file footprint. It also lets you concatenate files. So you can take a bunch of different JavaScript files, munge them together, minify them, and put them into a single file so that your site is going to perform much more quickly. All right, so let's install uglify. And you run this command in your project directory. For every task that you want to run for a particular project, you have to install the plugin in that directory. It gets loaded into the Node modules directory. So let's do it. So npm install node-contrib bode, node-contrib uglify -save dev. And let me just talk for just a moment about this node-contrib. There are certain modules for Node that are considered sort of like canonical. They're like the primary, most respected and important grunt modules. So they are contrib. Oh, I misspelled that. All right. I run. And what did I do? Oh, sorry. No wonder. It's not node-contrib, it's grunt-contrib. Grunt, bam. There we go. Cool. Yeah. All right, so now that we've installed that, we have that first step. Now we configure that in our grunt file.js. So what we do is inside that config, init config is a method of the grunt object in grunt. So it's basically a command that grunt runs, and you pass to it a piece of information, and you pass to it a JavaScript object. That's what those little curly braces here and here are. That's an object that you're passing in. And that object itself is composed of other pieces of information. So this is a property, this is a property value. This is a property, and this is a value, which happens to be another object. So we're passing what's called the uglify object. That's really terrible. And inside that, we pass a property called build. Doesn't have to be. I'll talk about different names you can use, but I'm going to call it build. And that has a value, which is yet another property. So literally, it's like going down a rabbit hole, because we have objects inside of objects inside of objects. So let me build this up in my file. It goes in here, and I'm not going to type it all, so I think let's do uglify. Cool. So now we have our task. What is this task saying? Well, let's talk a minute about the file organization. I showed you before at the beginning of this how we had this organized. But let's look at this. We have our source folder. Inside that we have our JavaScript folder. And inside that we have 2 JavaScript files. So this is the directory holding my working JavaScript files, the ones I'm going to edit as I'm doing development. Then we have this Java.js folder, which is outside in our main directory for our project. And this is a directory that's going to hold my final compressed and concatenated file. Okay. So looking back at this, we have this build object, and it has 2 properties, source and dest. Those are important. Those names, source, src, and dest, are what the uglify module is looking for. It needs those, and they give it 2 pieces of information. The source gives it the source of the JavaScript files. Those are the files it's going to read in, concatenate, and minify, and then the output is where it's supposed to go. Okay? You'll notice that I specified for the source, it's src/js/asterisk.js. Asterisk is a wildcard character, which basically says, find every single file inside of there that ends in .js, and you're going to minify them all, bring them all together, and out of that, you'll create a script.min.js file. Okay, so we've configured. That's step 1 inside our grunt file. The next thing we need to do is we load the plugin using the load npm tasks method. So I load npm tasks, and I type, what did I say? Grunt contrib. Grunt contrib uglify. Okay, so now I'm telling Grunt what package it's supposed to load, and then I have a third step. And the last step for this particular task, I register this task. Basically, I have to tell Grunt what of that configuration that I set up, what am I supposed to run? And I'm going to run this thing, uglify, and it has this sub-object called build. So I'm going to say, I need to run uglify :build. Okay, so this is saying that we're registering our default task is this task. Okay. All right, so let's look at it all together up here. There's the init config, loading the plugins, and registering the tasks. All right, and then once you've done that, you save your grunt file, and then you run it. You just type grunt. You must run this command within the project directory. So let's let me first go over here, and here's our project. I'm going to show you that this works. Here's this script file, and I'm just going to delete it. So now there's no JavaScript file, right? It's gone. But when I run Grunt, it should take these files and concatenate them and minify them. So let's see what it does. All right, type Grunt. And it says, one file created, done without errors. That's cool. Let's see if it did it. And indeed it did. There it is, brand new file, minified, concatenated. It combines both that jQuery file and that scroll2.js file that I wrote to show you what they look like in their previous state. This is the uncompressed jQuery file, full of comments, full of code. Here's my file, lots of line space, lots of empty space, and here's the final output, much, much smaller. All right, so cool, we've got Grunt running. And now that you know this is the basic template for all Grunt tasks. Once you've figured out this, you can go and get any plugin, follow the same 4 steps, and run any of those Grunt commands. All right, so let's talk about different types of tasks. Dev tasks versus build tasks. A build task is like, I'm ready to launch my website. I need to get everything in its final small as possible, hard to read format, so it's really tiny and works really quickly. But when you're developing, when you're programming your JavaScript and your CSS, you don't want all your code to be minified and munged and mangled because it makes it really hard to see where the errors are. You can't accurately run a debugger or see what the console output in the JavaScript console isn't so good. So what is ideal is to have 2 separate tasks. So when you're doing development, you can run Grunt and it will concatenate files but leave them uncompressed. And they'll compile your Sass into CSS but leave it uncompressed. And then when you're ready to launch your website, you run a build task, which makes your files as small as possible. How do you do that with Grunt? Well, fortunately, it's built in kind of to Grunt. You remember I created this Uglify task, and I actually gave it a name called build. Okay? And so this is going to run when I run a build command, as you'll see in a second. If I want to have a dev task, let's see, oops, skip that. I did that. I get what I'm doing. Sorry, I forgot the game plan. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to update the gruntfile.js. So currently you'll see that that grunt file has this thing called default. And what default is if I just run grunt, that's what happens. These tasks run. But I'm going to create a new one. I'll just copy this. And I'll name it build. And so now, to run that, I just type grunt build. And that will run just that task, grunt build. So what about our development tasks? How do we create those? Well, when we're developing, we don't want to minify our code. We don't want to concatenate our files. So let's create a dev task. This is what we're going to create. And I'll talk about that code in just a second, but let me create it. So I'm going to go here. Here's my build task. I'll add a comma like this, and I'm going to insert another property with another object that's going to be my development. Make it look good. Okay. So let's look at that code, and let me tell you what it's doing. So most plugins, most Grunt tasks have options. Options that you can set that affect how that particular task works. In this case, with Uglify, I have options called beautify, mangle, compress, and preserve comments. And if I set those, I'm not going to get minified or hard-to-read code output. In fact, that beautify option right there will actually make code that isn't written very well look better. So that when it's output during development, if somebody gave me a JavaScript file that was cruddy looking, like not indented or was all on one line, beautify will actually convert it to look much easier to read and better for me to debug. You'll notice that the source and destination are the same. It's the same thing as before. So I'm basically now taking 2 files and concatenating them into one, but I'm not minifying them. So all you have to do is register that task. And so basically your default task that I've got here listed in my grunt file, let's see it right here. This should be the tasks that you want to run most often. And most often, the tasks that you want to run are your development tasks, because you're constantly developing. You're not as often deploying or putting your website, a brand new version of your website up on your server. So the default here is now my dev version of Uglify. And let's see what happens. Remember, here's my script, min.js, minified, concatenated. And let's see what happens when I run my grunt. And remember, it's default, so I just have to type grunt. And it's going to say, one file created, done without errors. Now when I go over here, what? Total magic. That's right, look at that. Comments are in place. And here's my code, and here's jQuery code, concatenated. So I got the benefit of concatenation without the obfuscation that makes it difficult for debugging. Yeah?
The names dev and build, do you have to use those, or could I have a third or fourth option that set up?
You can have a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh option, whatever you want. And in fact, dev and build are not required. That's just what I named them. Sometimes people will call, like build, they'll call dist for distribution. And if I change it there, all I have to do is change it down here. So that's dist. Disney, dist. So dist and build are my terms, commonly used, but you can call it dist, you can call it whatever. So I want to keep it with build, though, because that's how I do it. Okay. So yes, this and this you can change, name them yourself. But these actual options within, this is Uglify. It needs this to work. Okay, we did it. We got one task. It can run in two different ways depending on what we're doing at the time, deploying or developing. So let's look at another one called watching tasks. There is a Grunt plugin that lets you watch for file changes. When you make a change to a file, it automatically runs a task. So in the case of our JavaScript, remember I'm working on these separate JavaScript files in this source directory. When I make a change to them, I need them to be concatenated and put into another place because my web page is looking for the scripts.js file inside the JS folder. So my changes are not going to be reflected immediately unless Grunt does its thing. So the watch task lets it just sort of sit around watching for files change. Remember my demo earlier when I said, oh, let's change the background color to blue from white. Suddenly it updated because the watch task was sitting there and looking for changes that I made to the files. So we install watch. You run this command within your project directory because you're installing it into your project. I don't want to type all that. There it is. So now I have watch installed. The programming is in place. I need to add it to my Grunt file. So we start with configuration. So I'm going to add this new object or new property called watch, which has an object inside of it, and it has a property called JS, and then it has some files and some tasks. So the files are the files the watch command is supposed to look for. So when it sees changes to any of the files indicated here with files, it runs the task listed under tasks. So if I make a change to any of my source JavaScript files, it'll run the Uglify development task, which will concatenate my files and put them in a new location. So let's add that. Okay. So the thing that's very much like a rabbit hole when you're working with Grunt is all of these nested properties and objects and properties and objects. So it can get a little hairy. Just watch your P's and Q's. And it's good to have a text editor like Sublime or something that highlights matching brackets. So you'll notice when I clicked here, it may be kind of hard to see. This is underlined and this is underlined, indicating these are pairs. They're connected. And if you accidentally miss a pair, it stops working. So you can sort of see what pairs go with what pairs. Okay, so that's my watch task. What do I do now? I've configured it. I load the plugin in the gruntfile.js using the load npm tasks method. So that's this. And is it contrib watch? Yeah. Okay, so now I've got that. And usually with Grunt plugins, you have to then do something, you have to register a task. But with watch, you don't. Actually, you just run grunt watch. I'll show you what happens when you do that. Let's do grunt watch. So now it's running the watch task. And see, it says it's waiting, because it's sitting there, seeing if I'm going to make any changes to any of my files. So I'm going to go here and go to my scroll to.js. This is inside of my source directory. So this isn't part of my website. This isn't a file that my index page normally loads. So I'll make a change here, and I'll save the file. And you'll see that it just ran that task. So it now took my changes and put it into the actual file that the home page will load. So that's what watch does. It sits there looking. Any changes that I make, they register and do it. Okay? Super cool. All right, how are we doing? You hanging on? Not lost? Still see the rabbit? All right. Sass. How many people here use Sass? Cool. So Sass is a CSS pre-processing language. It lets you write CSS in ways that make it more efficient, faster for you to write. It lets you use like variables, for example. It lets you do like mathematical calculations. It lets you easily combine and concatenate files actually as part of how Sass works. So the problem with Sass is that web browsers don't know what the hell it is. They can't read it and they can't display it. So you need to convert Sass to CSS for it to work. That's where Grunt comes in. It can handle that for you. And we need to install the plugin. Very simple. Okay, there's two versions. There's Grunt Contrib Sass, which I say avoid because first you need Ruby installed for it to work. And also it's much slower. It's a Ruby-based compiler. And the only benefit of Grunt Contrib Sass is that it is the most up-to-date with where Sass is. Sass changes. And Grunt Sass is not always as up-to-date. And it's not Grunt Sass's fault. It's the libsass C library that is a little behind the regular Ruby-based compiler. Anyway, so npm install grunt sass -- save - dev. So I'm going to do npm install grunt contrib grunt sass save - dev. And those warnings there are just, I left out a couple fields of my JSON file, and it doesn't like that, but it's just a warning. It's not really an error. All right, so a bunch of stuff was loaded. And if I go here and I show you my package.json file, notice as I'm adding these things, they get added to the package.json file, so they're keeping track. That's because I did that -- save - dev. Okay, so let's look about the file organization for my CSS. Okay, as I mentioned, there's a source folder, and then inside that is a SCSS folder. And in that is this application.scss. That's my main Sass file. And Sass already has this kind of clever way of concatenating Sass files to make a single CSS file, which is really nice. So my application.css loads this normalized.scss, which also loads this main.scss. And when I compile this, I'll get this, the styles.css. So I'll get a CSS file that a web browser can read. That's the compiled version. That's what Grunt's going to do for us. So we need to add some configuration to our Grunt file. We add another property called Sass, and it has an object with a couple of options in there. So we have dev and file. So let me add that, and then I'll talk about it. So let's look at this. So it's called Sass. Notice that I have a property called dev. That goes perfectly with my dev task, right, for my uglify. So now I'm going to have this Sass dev, okay? And what it does is it takes this file, compiles this file, and turns it into this file. So it's pretty nice. You don't have to give it much information for it to do its job. The options there where it says output style, expanded means that it's not going to be minified, it's going to be expanded. I'll be able to see the CSS, I'll be able to be able to identify any errors I might have made or look at the styling so I can correctly fix it in my Sass file. All right. Then we load the plugin in our Grunt file. That's the load npm tasks. And then we register the task. Okay. Let me do those two things. And then we're almost done. We're at the last task that we're going to cover tonight. So Grunt Sass. Okay. And you'll notice that this is the register task, and I said it's default. And this is the one, when I type grunt, this is what runs. And currently it says uglify, but you can have multiple tasks listed here inside of this thing. This thing is, what do those square brackets indicate in JavaScript? It's an array. So you're passing a list of tasks. So I'm going to say, okay, there's uglify, and then I'll just say Sass dev, like that. So, oops, comma. So now when I just run grunt, we'll run this task, and then we'll run this task. Okay, let's just try that first before I do this watch thing. And just to prove it, let me go to here, to my CSS, and let's delete that file. Let's delete it. So now my CSS is gone. I don't even have a CSS file. So let's make sure that Grunt's working. If I type grunt, one file created, Sass dev, Sass task, done without errors. Let's see, there it is. So it just compiled that and put it into my directory for me. Now, most commonly, you're going to want to add that to a watch task, right? Because you want every change you make in your Sass files, you want to be instantly updated for your preview. So you do that by adding yet another property to the watch object, CSS, and it has the same two properties itself, files and tasks. So when these files change, run this task. So this is my dev, so that's for development. Oh wait, we're on watch. Here's watch. And okay. So notice that it's looking at different files for the CSS. It's looking at any SCSS file inside the source folder, and it's running a different task. It's only going to run the Sass dev task. So when I go over here and I say grunt watch, it's sitting and watching. It's waiting. And when I make a change to my Sass file, let's see. Let's make a change to the layout. Okay. So here I'll change the background color to green, save this, and if we look over here, you'll see it did it. It ran its task. It compiled that Sass and put it into my directory. So now I've got this updated with wherever it is. Well, trust me, it did it. It updated it. So, oh, green is what it is, body green. There it is. So there, it updated it in my CSS file. Cool. So if I make a change here, let's make it blue, and I'll save it, and go to my styles.css, it's now blue. All right? So that's what watch does for you. Watch is super helpful as part of your development. All right. Now, finally, we can add a build task for Sass, because when we are going to launch our website, we want to make sure our CSS is compressed as possible. And there's an output option or output style called compress for Sass files, which minifies and munges down your CSS as much as possible. So let's add that to our Grunt file. So that is part of this particular task, Sass. We have one called dev, so I need to add one called build. And so this is now our build. So it should compress. I'll save this file. And now when I make a change in here, let's say it doesn't really matter. I'll make a change, save this, and go over here. And when it's watching, it's an ongoing task, and you can't type into the terminal. If you hit Control-C, it ends. And so I've ended it. Now, remember, I added this new task as part of the build process. And Grunt Watch is only looking at changes to files. So I can say Grunt build. So this is when I'm ready to launch my website or post it up, and I want everything to be minified. I run the build task, and it's going through, doing some stuff. And if I go, oh, I forgot one step, didn't I? I have to add down here. This is my build task. So I add one more, and that's Sass build, like that. Now it should do it. Grunt build. So it says Sass build. And if I now look at my styles.css, it's all munged. All the spaces are gone, everything. This is one super huge long string. So now I have a much smaller file for when I'm loading this up to the websites. So we minify these files by using the compressed output style. And you run it, like I said, grunt build. There we are. We've reached the bottom of the rabbit hole, and we found the rabbit. That is how you use Grunt. There's a lot of steps, but you've now mastered it. Sure. So there are thousands of plugins that do lots of different things. The Watch plugin, for example, that I showed you has a component called Live Reload. That's something I demonstrated earlier, where when I made changes to my file, the web browser literally reloaded the web page. That's part of the Watch process, but it also requires a Chrome extension to work. There's a few more steps. That's Grunt. Are there any questions? Yeah.
What are the complications in moving a project file? So you have it up and running, and you decide, you know what, when I change the directory structure, I don't want to move the project file, this Grunt project file.
Okay, so the question is, you want to change maybe the directory structure of your project. Are you talking about you want to move the entire project somewhere else? You decided, oh, it should go in this other place?
The Grunt portion of it.
So I guess why you want to move the Grunt portion? What do you mean by that?
Well, show us the directory structure.
Yeah.
So if I want to move, so what I have to grab here is what? Gruntfile.js, node modules, and package.js. Could I grab those three?
If you move them, it's gone. You're not using Grunt on it anymore. I mean, if you, I assume what you're saying is you don't want to upload these to your website, for example, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. So there are additional Grunt plugins that let you deploy. So literally using SFTP or FTP or Git or some other protocol to move your files to another location. And as part of that, you can specify which files go. And so those will not go. But if you literally are like moving these things out, the only way to get it working again is to move them exactly back to where you took them from. Does that answer that? Cool. Other questions about Grunt? Has anyone used Grunt? Anybody here dabbled in it? Yeah? Had troubles with it ever? Yeah? Okay.
Could you go through if we're looking for a new plugin, how to navigate the website extract kind of the bare minimum without having to read every single bit of documentation?
No. So the question is there a way to like find a Grunt plugin and not have to read all the documentation to understand how it works? Is that
Well, like,
right?
Is there like a method that you use when you're looking for a Grunt plugin to kind of...
So this is the Grunt website. This is their plugins directory. I would not say that I've ever gone to the plugins directory as a place to look for a plugin. I find my plugins through Twitter, social media, what people in the industry are using, blog posts that say, I just tried out this awesome, plugin. It does this and this and this. You should give it a try. When I hear about it, then I could go here and I could say, okay, let's check out what is it? It's called Contrib Watch. So I can search for it. And there it is. And so that's a good sign. It's got a star. It's been downloaded 662,000 times, so that's probably a pretty good thing. Well, it's not updated that recently. So there is some data here that once somebody's pointing me in a direction that might be like, oh, that's cool, there's some data here that lets me know, should I bother with it? I mean, Sinatra server, maybe it's good, maybe it's not, but it's been downloaded 0 times. So I don't know, I don't know if I would risk it or not do it or use it or not. There's not much horrible that will go on with a Grunt plugin. As I mentioned, if you're on a Mac and you use Homebrew provides a level of security that normally you don't get if you try to use sudo to install. So in addition, hopefully everyone here is using Git. So if you're not using Git, start using Git. So if you do install some plugin that somehow munges some files for you, you just check out the previous commit of your repo and you're back to where you started. But yeah, I don't really go here. It's just word of mouth. And I'm not into, there are people who develop very elaborate Grunt workflows that have like bunches of different tasks and then like hundreds literally of steps of stuff that happens to deploy their application. I don't do that. I don't build sites that need that. So. Other questions about Grunt? Yeah, sir. Oh, yeah. So Grunt is not the only player in town. Gulp is another one. Gulp is also a task runner. What do they call it? A streaming task runner or something like that? I don't know. So Gulp has an advantage in that it has a very different syntax, the way you write. Basically, it's very similar. It does same kinds of things. There are plugins for Gulp. There's a Gulp file, but it looks different than a Grunt file. It's configured in a very different way. The main benefit that I've heard that people talk about why Gulp is great is it uses streams, which are part of Node. Streams let you stream data and pipe it from one command to another. Grunt literally requires a lot of file I/O. You have to you're concatenating, you have to make a temporary set of files, and then it does a bunch of stuff and moves them and then deletes the old stuff. There's a lot of writing to disk and stuff. And on really big sites with lots and lots of files, Grunt can be slower than Gulp. Gulp can be really quick. However, the guy, what's the guy's name? The guy behind this, Ben Allman, Cowboy or something is his Twitter handle. Behind Grunt is rewriting it with streaming. So basically, the main advantage of Gulp is going to be at some point with Grunt Grunt will solve that. Grunt will solve the problem with that. So yeah, there's two, and there's like everybody, there's little holy wars around which is better and da 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 da. And oh, you're a Grunt person. Well, you must be a dinosaur. That kind of stuff. But don't worry about it. I use Grunt. Ember, all the people behind Ember. Well, I guess they switched from Grunt to their own thing. But anyway, Grunt's good. Gulp's good. Maybe I'll do a Gulp thing as well. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh, Sass versus Less. Less is another, compiled CSS thing. Bob. I don't like Less. I don't use it. I like Sass. I use Sass. It's fine. People can use whatever they want. There's really, there's people who use either. They accomplish similar goals. They have different types of syntax. I think Sass has more mind share. I think there's more people behind it. In the Treehouse library, we have tons of Sass material. And so I've learned a lot of Sass from the people who teach at Treehouse. So, but I don't know. I don't think they're that different. And if you're using less, then there are Grunt plugins that process less as well. And of course, Twitter Bootstrap is less based too. So, all right, no more questions? Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming. Before you take off, well, clap for me first. Thank you.